The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. when Officer Rick Hayes spotted the silver sedan weaving slightly between lanes on Highway 95. It wasn't dramatic swerving, just enough to catch his attention. After 12 years on the force, Rick had developed a sixth sense for these things. Something about the way the car moved felt off, like the driver was distracted or maybe fighting to stay awake. He flipped on his lights and pulled the cruiser behind the sedan. The car didn't stop immediately, which made Rick's pulse quicken just a bit. Instead, it continued for another quarter-mile before finally pulling onto the shoulder. That hesitation, that extra distance, it always meant something. Either the driver was looking for a well-lit spot, which was smart, or they were buying time to hide something, which was trouble. Rick radioed in the stop and approached the driver's side window with his flashlight ready. The window rolled down and he found himself looking at a man who appeared to be in his late 30s. Maybe early 40s. His hair was messy, sticking up in odd directions, and his eyes had that hollow, exhausted look of someone who hadn't slept in days. The guy was wearing a wrinkled button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up unevenly. "Evening, sir. License and registration, please," Rick said, keeping his tone professional but friendly. That's when he noticed the man's hands. They were shaking as he reached for the glove compartment. Not the slight tremor of someone nervous about getting a ticket, but a genuine shake that spoke of adrenaline or fear or both. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked. His voice was steady enough, but his eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror and then back to Rick. "You were drifting between lanes back there. I need to make sure you're okay to drive." Rick took the offered license and studied it under his flashlight. "David Morrison, age 38, address in Baltimore." "Baltimore's a long way from here, Mr. Morrison." "Where are you headed tonight?" David's jaw tightened. Just driving at 3 in the morning, 300 miles from home." Rick kept his voice even, but his internal alarm system was starting to buzz. People didn't just drive aimlessly at this hour unless they were running from something or toward something, and neither option was usually good. "I couldn't sleep, needed to clear my head." David's answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Rick swept his flashlight across the interior of the car, fast food wrappers on the passenger seat, a road map folded wrong and stuffed in the door pocket, and there, something that made him pause. A small cut on David's left temple, fresh enough that it had only recently stopped bleeding, and on his collar, just visible in the flashlight beam, what looked like dried blood. "That's quite a cut you've got there. You mind telling me how that happened?" Rick's hand instinctively moved closer to his belt, not touching his weapon, but ready. David reached up and touched the spot as if he'd forgotten it was there. "Hit my head on a cabinet door earlier. Stupid accident." The explanation was plausible, but something about the way David said it felt wrong. Rick had interviewed hundreds of people over the years, and he'd learned to spot the difference between truth and carefully constructed lies. This felt like the latter. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, Mr. Morrison." "Is that really necessary?" David's voice had an edge to it now. Not aggressive, but definitely resistant. "I'm fine to drive. The coffee just hasn't kicked in yet. Step out of the vehicle, please." Rick's tone left no room for negotiation. He stepped back to give David space but kept his position where he could see the man's hands at all times. David hesitated for a long moment, his fingers gripping the steering wheel. Rick could see the internal debate playing out on his face, and that hesitation confirmed every instinct screaming in Rick's head that something was very wrong here. Finally, David opened the door and stepped out onto the shoulder. The guy was tall, maybe 6'1", and despite the exhausted appearance, he moved with a certain controlled precision that Rick recognized from his days in the military. This wasn't some random civilian who'd had too much to drink. David stood there, hands visible but tense, looking like he wanted to bolt but knew better. "Have you been drinking tonight?" Rick asked, though he could already tell the answer was no. There was no alcohol smell, no glassy eyes, no slurred speech. "No, sir." "Using any drugs or medication?" "No." Rick walked slowly around to the back of the sedan, keeping David in his peripheral vision. The license plate caught his attention. It looked slightly newer than the rest of the car, the screws holding it in place shinier than they should be. Another red flag. He made a mental note and continued his visual inspection through the rear window. That's when he saw the briefcase. It was sitting on the back seat, black leather with a combination lock glinting in the streetlight. Next to it was a jacket that looked like it had been hastily thrown there. And underneath the jacket, just barely visible, was what appeared to be the corner of another cell phone. Mr. Morrison, how many phones do you have with you? Rick asked, returning to where David stood. The question seemed to catch David off guard. His eyes widened just a fraction before he controlled his expression. Just one. My personal phone. Mind if I take a look in your vehicle? Actually, I do mind. Am I being detained or am I free to go? There it was. The shift from nervous civilian to someone who knew their rights, who'd probably said those exact words before in a very different context. Rick had heard that question 1,000 times, usually from people who had something to hide. Right now, you're being detained while I investigate a possible DUI and ensure there's no immediate danger. If you're not comfortable with me searching the vehicle, I can call for a K9 unit, but that's going to take some time, and you'll be standing here on the side of the road for the next hour or so. David's face hardened. I need to make a phone call. You'll have that opportunity if you're arrested. Right now, I need you to answer my questions. Where exactly are you coming from tonight? I told you I was just driving. For how long? David didn't answer. He just stood there staring at Rick with an intensity that was almost unsettling. It wasn't defiance exactly, more like calculation, as if he was running through scenarios in his head and trying to figure out which path led to the least damage. Rick pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I need backup at my location on Highway 95, mile marker 42. Copy that, 17. Backup is 10 minutes out. David closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, something had changed. The tension was still there, but underneath it was something else. Resignation, maybe, or acceptance. You have no idea what you're doing right now, he said quietly. Then help me understand. Mr. Morrison, tell me what's going on. But David just shook his head and went silent, staring out at the darkness beyond the highway lights. And in that silence, as the sound of distant sirens began to grow closer, Rick felt the weight of a puzzle he didn't even know he was holding. Whatever this was, it was bigger than a routine traffic stop. He just didn't know how much bigger yet. The backup arrived in the form of Officer Jennifer Torres, a rookie with only 2 years on the force but sharp eyes that missed nothing. She pulled up behind Rick's cruiser, and the additional lights turned the dark highway shoulder into something resembling a movie set. David stood there, hands now clasped behind his head as Rick had instructed, still silent as a stone. What have we got? Jennifer asked as she approached, her hand resting casually near her belt. Not sure yet, Rick admitted. Something's off. Guy's got a fresh head wound, dried blood on his clothes, and he's being evasive about everything. Won't tell me where he's been or where he's going. 300 miles from home at 3 in the morning with no real explanation. Jennifer walked a slow circle around the sedan, her flashlight beam dancing across the windows. When she reached the back seat, she stopped. Rick, you seeing what I'm seeing back here? The briefcase and the phones? Phones, plural? Jennifer's eyebrows shot up. How many we talking? That's what I'm about to find out. Rick turned to David. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to search your vehicle now. You can either consent or I can get a warrant based on reasonable suspicion. Your choice, but one way or another, I'm looking in that car. David finally spoke, his voice tired but firm. Do what you need to do. Rick pulled on a pair of latex gloves and opened the driver's side door. The interior smelled like stale coffee and stress, that particular scent of someone who'd been living in their car for days. He started with the glove compartment. Registration, insurance, a half-empty bottle of antacids, and underneath it all a second phone. Not hidden exactly, but not visible either. The center console yielded a third phone, this one turned off. Rick set each phone on the hood of the car as he found them, watching David's face for any reaction. The man gave nothing away, just stood there with that same calculated calm. Moving to the back seat, Rick carefully lifted the jacket. Underneath were 2 more phones and a portable charger with multiple cords. 5 phones total. Who needed 5 phones unless they were doing something they shouldn't be doing? Mr. Morrison, you want to explain why you're traveling with 5 cell phones? Rick asked. No comment. Jennifer whistled low. Check the trunk? Rick popped it open, and what he saw made his stomach drop. Stacks of cash, bundled with rubber bands, filled a small duffel bag. He didn't need to count it to know it was substantial. Next to the money were the spare license plates, still wrapped in plastic from wherever they'd been purchased. And tucked in the corner was a small black box that looked like some kind of electronic equipment, though Rick couldn't immediately identify its purpose. Well, this just got a whole lot more interesting, Jennifer muttered, pulling out her radio. We're going to need Detective Walsh down here. Rick lifted one of the cash bundles, fanning through the bills. all hundreds, crisp and sequential. He did a quick mental calculation based on the size of the stack, easily 20,000, maybe more, combined with the multiple phones, the spare plates, and David's complete unwillingness to explain any of it. This was looking less like a traffic stop and more like they'd stumbled into something big. "David Morrison," Rick said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official police business. "You're under arrest on suspicion of money laundering and engaging in criminal activity. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Rick continued reading the Miranda rights, David's expression didn't change. No panic, no protest, no desperate attempt to explain. He just stood there and took it, like he'd been expecting this outcome all along. When Rick finished and asked if he understood his rights, David simply nodded. They put him in the back of Rick's cruiser and called for a tow truck for the sedan. The ride to the station was silent except for the crackle of the police radio. Rick kept glancing in the rearview mirror at his passenger. David sat perfectly still, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, his face unreadable. At the station, they processed him through booking. Fingerprints, photos, personal effects cataloged and bagged. Through it all, David remained cooperative but silent. When they asked if he wanted to call a lawyer, he declined. When they asked if he wanted to make his one phone call, he declined that too. It was unusual. Most people in his situation would be scrambling for legal help or trying to contact family. But David seemed content to sit in the holding cell and wait. Detective Paul Walsh arrived around 6 in the morning, looking rumpled and annoyed at being pulled from his bed. He was a veteran with 25 years on the force, the kind of cop who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed by much anymore. Rick briefed him on the situation, laying out the phones, the cash, the plates, and David's complete refusal to explain any of it. "And he hasn't said anything? Not even tried to make up a story?" Walsh asked, flipping through the initial report. "One thing," Rick said. "When I arrested him, he told me I had no idea what I'd just done." "That's it? Nothing else?" Walsh grunted. "Let's see if we can change that." They moved David to Interrogation Room 2, a small windowless box with a metal table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. The fluorescent lights gave everything a harsh, washed-out quality. David sat on one side of the table, Walsh and Rick on the other. "So, David," Walsh began, his tone conversational, "you've had a few hours to think. Want to tell us what's going on?" "I want to make a phone call now," David said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since his arrest. "You declined that right during booking." "I've changed my mind. I need to make a call. It's important." Walsh leaned back in his chair, studying David with the patient intensity of a hunter. "Here's the thing. You've got 20 grand in cash, 5 phones, fake plates, and you won't tell us where you've been or what you've been doing. That tells me you're involved in something serious. Drug running, maybe. Human trafficking. Money laundering for organized crime. So before I let you make any calls, I need you to give me something. Help me understand what we're dealing with here." David's jaw clenched. For the first time since the stop, Rick saw genuine emotion cross his face. It looked like frustration or maybe desperation. "You need to call this number," David said, reciting a 10-digit number from memory. "Tell whoever answers that Operation Sandstone has been compromised. Tell them David Cross needs immediate extraction." Rick and Walsh exchanged glances. "Operation Sandstone? David Cross?" Was this guy delusional, or was he running some kind of elaborate con? "David Cross?" Walsh repeated. "I thought your name was David Morrison. Just make the call, please." There was urgency in David's voice now, the careful control starting to crack. "You're making a mistake keeping me here. People are in danger. I need to report in immediately." "What people?"
"What danger?"
Rick asked. David shook his head. "I can't tell you that. You don't have clearance. Just make the call. They'll verify who I am, and then you'll understand." Walsh stood up, motioning for Rick to follow him out into the hallway. They left David sitting there, his head in his hands, looking more exhausted than ever. "What do you think?" Rick asked once the door was closed. "I think he's either a very good actor or he's completely lost his mind," Walsh said. "Operation Sandstone? Extraction? Sounds like spy movie nonsense to me. But what if it's not?" Walsh sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Then we're about to have a very interesting morning. Come on, let's run this David Cross name through the system and see what pops up." They spent the next 2 hours at Walsh's computer, searching every database they had access to. David Morrison came back clean exactly as it had on the highway. But David Cross was even stranger. The name existed in the system, but the file was restricted. Access denied. No details, no history, just a notation that the file required federal clearance to view. Well, that's not something you see every day, Walsh muttered. Staring at the screen, Rick felt a chill run down his spine. What does that mean? It means either this guy really is connected to something federal, or he's stolen someone's identity who is. Either way, we're in over our heads. Walsh picked up his desk phone. I'm calling the captain. He needs to see this. Captain Vincent Rodriguez was a no-nonsense administrator who'd worked his way up from beat cop to running the whole department. When Walsh showed him the restricted file, his expression went from skeptical to concerned in about 3 seconds. Make the call, Rodriguez said. Use the number the suspect provided. Let's see what happens. Walsh dialed the number on speakerphone. It rang twice before someone picked up. Identification code, a male voice said. No greeting, no explanation, just those 2 words. Walsh hesitated. This is Detective Paul Walsh with the state police. We have a man in custody who gave us this number and said to tell you that Operation Sandstone has been compromised. He says his name is David Cross. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Rick could hear papers shuffling and keyboard clicks in the background. Hold the line, the voice said. They waited. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute, then 2. Rick's heart was pounding. Whatever this was, it was real. The voice on the other end hadn't laughed, hadn't hung up, hadn't treated them like they were crazy. Finally, a different voice came on the line. This one was deeper, with an authority that made even Captain Rodriguez stand up straighter. This is Director Walsh speaking. To whom am I talking? Captain Vincent Rodriguez, sir. I'm the commanding officer here. Captain, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Captain Rodriguez held the phone like it might explode at any second. The voice on the other end belonged to someone who was clearly used to being obeyed without question, and the entire room had gone quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Captain Rodriguez. My name is Director Michael Walsh. I'm calling from Langley, Virginia. What I'm about to tell you is classified, and I need your word that this conversation stays between us and only the officers directly involved in this arrest. Do I have your word? Rodriguez shot a look at Rick and Detective Walsh, who both nodded. Yes, sir. You have my word. The man you have in custody is a federal agent working undercover on a matter of national security. His real name is classified, but he's been operating under deep cover for the past 18 months. You've just arrested one of our most valuable assets in the middle of an active operation. The words hung in the air like smoke. Rick felt his stomach twist. He'd arrested a federal agent, a spy, someone who was supposed to be on the same side. All the pieces that hadn't made sense suddenly started clicking into place. But instead of relief, Rick felt a wave of dread. Sir, with all due respect, Rodriguez said carefully, how do we know you are who you say you are? Anyone could call and claim to be from the CIA. Smart question, Captain. I respect that. Give me your fax number. I'm going to send you credentials and authorization codes that you can verify through your federal liaison office. But I need you to understand something. Every minute that agent sits in your custody, every minute his face is in your system, every second that this arrest remains on record, we're putting lives at risk, including his. Rodriguez rattled off the fax number, and within 2 minutes their machine was spitting out documents. Official letterhead from the Central Intelligence Agency. Photo identification for Director Walsh. Authorization codes that Rodriguez immediately called to verify. Everything checked out. This wasn't a con or a mistake. This was real. What do you need from us? Rodriguez asked, his voice steady despite the bomb that had just been dropped in his lap. First, I need you to clear that interrogation room. Let Agent Cross and me speak privately. Second, you need to begin the process of expunging his arrest from your records. The prints, the photos, the booking information, all of it needs to disappear. We'll handle the technical side of that, but I need your cooperation. Third, nobody outside that room talks about this. Not to other officers, not to friends, not to family. This stays locked down. Understood. I'll set up the call transfer to Interrogation Room 2 right now. Rodriguez nodded at Rick and Detective Walsh, and they scrambled to set up the phone in the interrogation room. David, or whoever he really was, sat at the table looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours. When they told him he had a call from Director Walsh, something like relief washed over his face. Everyone out, Rodriguez ordered. This conversation is private. They filed out into the observation room next door, where they could see David, through the one-way mirror but couldn't hear what was being said. Rick watched as David picked up the phone, listened for a moment, and then began talking in short, clipped sentences. His whole posture changed. The exhausted civilian act dropped away, and in its place was someone who looked military, precise, professional. He was making a report, Rick realized, debriefing his superior on what had happened. The call lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, David hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, closing his eyes. He looked like a man who'd just set down a weight he'd been carrying for far too long. Rodriguez's phone rang. It was Director Walsh again. "Captain, I'm sending 2 of my people to your location. They'll be there within the hour. In the meantime, I need to brief you on what we're dealing with here so you understand the stakes. I'm listening. 18 months ago, we received intelligence about a domestic terrorism cell operating in your region. These aren't foreign operatives or religious extremists. These are homegrown radicals, former military mostly, who've been stockpiling weapons and planning an attack on a federal building. Our agent, the man you know as David Morrison, infiltrated their organization. He's been living as one of them, earning their trust, getting close to their leadership." Rick felt his mouth go dry. Domestic terrorists, the kind of people who bombed buildings and killed innocent civilians to make political statements. And they'd had someone on the inside this whole time. Last night, Director Walsh continued, there was a meeting. The cell's leader revealed the final details of their plan. Target, timeline, method. Everything we needed to shut them down. But someone in the group got suspicious. They started asking questions our agent couldn't answer convincingly. He had to extract himself from the situation quickly, and it got physical. That's where the head wound came from. "So he ran," Rodriguez said. "He ran, and he did exactly what he was trained to do. He grabbed the evidence, got in his car, and drove. He was supposed to make it to a safe house about 50 miles from where your officer pulled him over. Instead, he got stopped because he was exhausted and wasn't paying attention to his driving. Bad luck. Bad timing." Rick closed his eyes. Bad luck was right. If he'd just let the guy go with a warning, none of this would have happened. But how could he have known? David had looked and acted exactly like someone who was up to no good, because in a way he was. Just not the kind of no good Rick had assumed. "What happens now?" Rodriguez asked. "Now we try to salvage what we can of this operation. The cell doesn't know our agent's cover is blown. They think he just got spooked and ran. If we move fast, we can still use the intelligence he gathered to take them down. But we need him out of your system. We need this arrest to have never happened, at least not officially. What about my officers? They did their jobs. They followed procedure." "Your officers did exactly what they should have done," Director Walsh said, and Rick felt a small measure of relief at those words. Officer Hayes made a good stop. He saw something wrong, and he acted on it. In any other situation, he'd be getting a commendation. But this isn't any other situation, and now we need everyone to be flexible. Rodriguez looked through the glass at David, who was still sitting with his eyes closed. "This is bigger than a commendation, isn't it? If we hadn't stopped him, if he'd made it to that safe house, you'd have what you needed to stop an attack." "That's correct. And now? Now we're racing against the clock. The cell is planning to move in 3 weeks. We have the intelligence, but we need time to verify locations, identify all the members, coordinate with local and federal law enforcement. Every day matters. Every hour matters." The weight of that statement settled over the room like a blanket. Rick had spent his career dealing with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and petty criminals. This was something else entirely. This was life and death on a scale he'd never encountered. "Your people are on the way?" Rodriguez asked. "They should be pulling up to your station right now." As if on cue, there was a commotion in the front of the station. Rick heard raised voices and the sound of the desk sergeant trying to maintain order. Rodriguez stepped out of the observation room and Rick followed. 2 people had entered the station. A man in his 50s wearing a dark suit and an expression that suggested he didn't tolerate nonsense, and a woman about the same age with short, gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room in about 3 seconds. They weren't wearing uniforms, but they moved like law enforcement. Federal law enforcement. Captain Rodriguez, the man said, flashing credentials. I'm Agent Frank Mitchell. This is Agent Carol Stevens. We're here to collect our asset and handle the cleanup. He's in interrogation room 2. Follow me. They walked through the station in a tight group, other officers stopping their work to stare. News had already started to spread that something unusual was happening, though nobody except the people in that room knew exactly what. Rick wondered how long it would take for the rumors to start. Federal agents showing up to take custody of a suspect. Records being expunged. It was the kind of thing that spawned conspiracy theories. When they entered the interrogation room, David looked up. The relief on his face when he saw the 2 agents was obvious. Agent Mitchell gave him a slight nod, professional and restrained, but Rick could see the concern in the man's eyes. You okay? Mitchell asked. I've been better, David said, standing up. But I got everything. It's all in the briefcase, names, dates, locations, the target, the method, everything you need. Good. That's good. Let's get you out of here and somewhere secure. We'll debrief you properly once you've had some rest. Agent Stevens turned to Rodriguez. Captain will need all copies of the arrest record, the booking photos, the fingerprint cards, everything related to this incident. Our tech team will scrub your digital systems remotely, but we need the physical documents. Already pulled, Rodriguez said, handing over a thick manila envelope. Everything's in there. What about the vehicle and the evidence inside? Rick asked. We'll take possession of the car and its contents, Mitchell said. The cash is operational funds. The phones are burners used for communication with the cell. The spare plates were part of his cover identity. All of it needs to come with us. David walked toward the door, but then he stopped and turned to Rick. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other. Rick saw exhaustion in David's eyes, but also something else. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. You did good work tonight, officer, David said quietly. I mean that. You saw something wrong and you didn't let it slide. That's exactly what a cop should do. Even though it complicated your mission, Rick asked. Even though. The world needs cops who pay attention, who trust their instincts, who don't look the other way. That's what keeps people safe. He held out his hand and Rick shook it. Thank you for your service. Then he was gone, escorted out by the 2 federal agents, leaving Rick standing in an empty interrogation room, wondering if any of the last few hours had actually been real. The station felt different after the federal agents left with David. There was a strange energy in the air, like everyone knew something significant had happened, but nobody could talk about it. Rick sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without really seeing it. His shift had ended 2 hours ago, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Detective Walsh dropped into the chair next to him, holding 2 cups of terrible station coffee. He slid one across to Rick without a word. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping the bitter liquid and trying to process what they'd just been part of. You ever have one of those nights where you question everything you think you know? Walsh finally asked. Rick let out a tired laugh. Yeah, tonight qualifies. I've been doing this job for 25 years. Thought I'd seen it all. Drug dealers, murderers, corrupt politicians, you name it. But this? Walsh shook his head. This is a whole different level. Think we did the right thing? Rick asked. Letting him go like that? We didn't let him go. We released a federal agent to his superiors. There's a difference. But Walsh didn't sound entirely convinced by his own words. Though I'll admit, part of me wonders if we just got played by some elaborate con. Those credentials were real. I watched Rodriguez verify them. I know, but still. Walsh drained his coffee and crushed the paper cup. Guess we'll know in 3 weeks when either the FBI makes arrests or a building gets bombed. The casual way he said it made Rick's blood run cold. That was the reality they were dealing with. Somewhere out there, people were planning to kill innocent civilians, and the only thing standing between them and mass murder was the intelligence David had gathered. Intelligence that might have been compromised because Rick had pulled him over for drifting between lanes. Stop that, Walsh said, reading Rick's expression. Stop beating yourself up. You made a righteous stop. Everything you did was by the book. Nobody could have known. But if you'd just given him a warning, And he turned out to be an actual criminal. And something bad happened later. You'd be sitting here asking yourself why you didn't trust your instincts. You can't win that game, kid. You did your job. That's all any of us can do. Captain Rodriguez emerged from his office and walked over to them. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past few hours. Hayes Walsh, my office now! They followed him into the small, cluttered room that smelled like old coffee and stress. Rodriguez closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk, arms crossed. What we dealt with tonight never happened, he said bluntly. I mean that literally. There's no arrest record, no booking photos, no fingerprints in the system. As far as anyone outside this room is concerned, you pulled over a civilian, gave him a warning for erratic driving, and sent him on his way. That's the story. That's the only story. What about the other officers who saw him? Rick asked. Jennifer was there at the scene. The desk sergeant processed him. People saw the federal agents come in. I've already talked to everyone who had contact with the situation. They've been briefed on the need for operational security. If anyone asks, it was a mistaken identity situation. Guy had outstanding warrants in another state, but it turned out to be a paperwork error, boring, bureaucratic, forgettable. The kind of thing that happens once a month and nobody thinks twice about. Walsh nodded slowly. And if someone doesn't stick to the story? Rodriguez's expression hardened. Then they're compromising a federal investigation and potentially endangering lives. I made that very clear. Everyone understands the stakes. What about us? Rick asked. What are we supposed to do? Just go back to regular patrol like nothing happened. That's exactly what you do. You go back to your normal jobs, you don't discuss this with anyone, not even each other unless absolutely necessary, and you move on. In a few weeks, this will all be over one way or another and we can breathe easier. But Rick couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be that simple. He'd looked into David's eyes. He'd seen the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of whatever secrets he was carrying. That wasn't something you just forgot about. The next few days were surreal. Rick went through his normal routine, patrol shifts, traffic stops, paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to that night on Highway 95. He found himself wondering where David was now. Was he safe? Was he still undercover? Or had the operation been completely compromised? There was no way to know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. On the fourth day, Rick was having lunch at a diner near the station when Agent Mitchell walked in. The federal agent spotted Rick immediately and slid into the booth across from him without asking permission. Officer Hayes, Mitchell said by way of greeting. Mind if I join you? Looks like you already have, Rick replied, setting down his sandwich. Mitchell ordered coffee from the waitress and waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. I wanted to thank you. What you did that night, pulling over our agent, it actually might have saved his life. Rick blinked in surprise. How do you figure that? I thought I'd compromised the whole operation. You did complicate things, Mitchell admitted. But here's what you didn't know. The cell was planning to test our agent that night. They were going to have him participate in something that would have proven his loyalty beyond any doubt. Something violent. If he'd made it to that meeting, he would have had to either blow his cover or cross a line he couldn't come back from. What kind of test? Mitchell's jaw tightened. The kind that ends with someone dead. When he didn't show up, when they couldn't reach him on his burner phones, they assumed he'd gotten cold feet and run. Which is exactly what we wanted them to think. It gave us time to reposition our assets and move forward with the takedown on our terms instead of theirs. Rick sat back in the booth, trying to process this new information. So the arrest was actually a good thing? Let's say it was a fortunate accident. Not ideal, but better than the alternative. Mitchell's coffee arrived, and he took a long sip before continuing. The director wanted you to know that. Wanted you to understand that your instincts were right, both in making the stop and in recognizing something was wrong. That's good police work. Is he safe? David, I mean. He's in protective custody until this is over. We've got him tucked away somewhere secure where the cell can't reach him even if they wanted to. He's cooperating fully with the investigation, helping us identify targets and plan the raids. Raids? Plural, Mitchell nodded. These people have multiple safe houses, weapons caches scattered across 3 states, and at least 15 active members we've identified so far. Taking them down is going to require simultaneous operations to prevent anyone from getting away or activating their plan early. It's a complex operation, and you think you can pull it off? We don't have a choice. These people aren't amateurs. They've got military training, resources, and a genuine willingness to die for their cause. The target they selected is a federal courthouse. They were planning to hit it during business hours when it would be full of civilians, judges, court staff. We're talking hundreds of potential casualties. The diner suddenly felt too warm. Rick pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. When? The raids are scheduled for this weekend. Multiple teams hitting multiple locations at the same time. If everything goes according to plan, by Monday morning these people will be in custody and the threat will be neutralized. Mitchell paused. But plans don't always survive contact with reality. What happens if something goes wrong? Then we deal with it. That's the job. Mitchell stood up, dropping a 20 on the table to cover both their meals. Keep doing what you're doing, Officer Hayes. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to the details. The world needs cops like you. As Mitchell walked out of the diner, Rick sat there feeling the weight of everything he now knew. Somewhere out there, federal agents were preparing to raid terrorist cells. David was in hiding, probably being debriefed day and night, reliving every moment of his 18-month undercover operation, and Rick had to just go about his normal life pretending none of it was happening. That night, Rick couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through the events of that traffic stop over and over in his mind. Every decision, every observation, every word spoken. He'd done his job, followed his training, trusted his gut, and somehow accidentally he'd become part of something much bigger than a routine traffic stop. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from an unknown number. Thank you for your service. Both that night and after. Stay safe. DC. Rick stared at the message for a long time. DC. David Cross. The man had somehow gotten his personal number and taken the time to send a message despite everything else he was dealing with. Rick typed out a response. Stay safe too. But before he could hit send, the number was already disconnected. The message couldn't be delivered. He set the phone down and closed his eyes. In 2 days, those raids would happen. In 2 days, he'd know if all of this had been worth it. If the arrests, the complications, the secrets, if it had all led to something good. Until then, all he could do was wait and trust that the people handling this knew what they were doing. But trust had never been easy for Rick. It went against every instinct he had as a cop. Trust was how criminals got away, how innocent people got hurt, how bad situations became worse. But sometimes he was learning. Trust was all you had. He thought about David wherever he was, probably thinking the same thoughts. Two people on different sides of the same fight, both trying to do the right thing, both hoping it would be enough. Rick finally drifted off to sleep around 4 a.m, his dreams filled with highways and headlights and voices asking questions he didn't know how to answer. The weekend arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air. Rick worked his Saturday shift in a fog of anticipation and dread, checking his phone between calls even though he knew there wouldn't be any updates. Operations like this didn't send out press releases in real time. He'd learn what happened when everyone else did, probably from the evening news. By Saturday afternoon, he was pulling into his driveway when his phone finally rang. It was Captain Rodriguez. Turn on the news, Rodriguez said without preamble. Any channel. It's happening. Rick rushed inside and flipped on the television. Breaking news banners scrolled across every major network. FBI raids in progress across 3 states. Suspected domestic terrorism cell. Multiple arrests. Live helicopter footage showed SWAT teams surrounding a rural compound. Agents in tactical gear moving with precision through buildings. He sat on his couch, remote hanging loose in his hand, and watched it all unfold. The reporters didn't have many details yet, just the basics. Coordinated federal operation. Months of investigation. Imminent threat prevented. The words washed over him as cameras captured suspects being led out in handcuffs, their faces blurred for the broadcast. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Walsh. We did that. Rick typed back. David did that. We all did. The news coverage continued for hours. By evening, the official press conference started. The FBI director stood at a podium, flanked by other officials Rick didn't recognize. The director's statement was carefully worded, praising the work of multiple agencies, thanking local law enforcement for their cooperation, and assuring the public that a significant threat had been neutralized. Today's operation resulted in the arrest of 17 individuals connected to a domestic terrorism organization that was planning a large-scale attack on a federal courthouse. Thanks to the dedicated work of our agents and the intelligence gathered through a long-term undercover operation, we were able to prevent what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. 17 arrests. Rick did the math in his head. Agent Mitchell had mentioned at least 15 members. They'd gotten them all, plus a couple more. The operation had been a complete success. But the director never mentioned David. Never mentioned the undercover agent who'd spent 18 months of his life living with these people, earning their trust, gathering the intelligence that made today possible. That omission felt wrong to Rick, even though he understood why it had to be that way. David's identity had to stay buried, both for his own safety and in case he was needed for future operations. The next morning, Rick was at the station early, filling out paperwork from a fender bender the night before, when Captain Rodriguez called him into his office. Detective Walsh was already there, along with Agent Mitchell and Agent Stevens. The two federal agents looked tired but satisfied, the kind of exhaustion that came after completing a difficult job successfully. "Officer Hayes," Mitchell said, standing to shake his hand. "Wanted to give you the debrief personally. Yesterday's operations were successful across the board. All primary targets in custody, weapons seized, and we recovered detailed plans for the attack. The courthouse is safe. The public is safe. Any casualties?" Rick asked. "2 suspects fired on our teams. Both were neutralized with non-lethal force and are receiving medical treatment. No agents or civilians were injured. It was as clean as these things get." Stevens pulled out a folder and set it on Rodriguez's desk. "This is for the official record. A letter of commendation for Officer Hayes and Detective Walsh for their role in assisting a federal investigation. It's vague enough that it won't raise questions, but it goes in your permanent files." Rick picked up the letter and skimmed it. Standard bureaucratic language about cooperation and professionalism. It didn't tell the real story, but he supposed that was the point. The real story would never be told, at least not publicly. "What about David?" Rick asked. "Is he okay?" Mitchell and Stevens exchanged a glance. "Agent Cross has been debriefed and is currently in a transition program. After 18 months undercover, it takes time to readjust to normal life. He'll receive counseling, medical care, and eventually reassignment to a different role within the agency. He's earned a desk job if he wants it, though knowing him, he'll probably volunteer for another undercover operation in 6 months. Can I talk to him?" "Not directly, no. For security reasons, we need to maintain separation between him and anyone connected to the arrest. But I can tell you that he specifically asked about you, wanted to make sure you understood that your actions that night were good police work, and that you shouldn't second-guess yourself." Rick nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. He'd probably never see David again, never get to have a real conversation with him, never get to ask the questions that had been building up in his mind. The man was a ghost, slipping back into whatever shadows the CIA kept its deep cover operatives in. "There's one more thing," Mitchell said, pulling an envelope from his jacket. "This is from Agent Cross. He wrote it during his debrief. We screened it for classified information and it's clean. Figured you'd want to read it." Rick took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. His name was written on the front in neat, precise handwriting. He waited until the meeting was over and he was alone at his desk before opening it. The letter was short, maybe half a page, but every word felt deliberately chosen. "Officer Hayes, I wanted to write this while the details were still fresh in my mind. That night on Highway 95, you did exactly what a good cop should do. You saw something suspicious. You trusted your instincts and you didn't let it slide, even though it would have been easier to just let me go with a warning. That kind of attention to detail, that dedication to the job, it's rare and valuable. I won't lie and say the arrest didn't complicate things. It did. But complications aren't always bad. Sometimes they force better solutions than we would have found otherwise. In this case, your stop gave us the exit strategy we needed at exactly the right moment, even though none of us knew it at the time. 18 months is a long time to live a lie. To wake up every day and pretend to be someone you're not. To befriend people you know you're going to betray. To ignore your own values in service of a larger mission. There were days I wasn't sure I'd make it through. Days when the line between David Morrison and my real self got so blurred I couldn't tell which one I was anymore. Your arrest reminded me who I really was. A federal agent working to protect innocent people. Not a member of a terrorist cell. Not a criminal. When you read me my rights, when you processed me through your system, it was like being pulled back to reality after months of living in a nightmare. So thank you. Thank you for your service, for your professionalism, and for caring enough about your community to pull over a suspicious driver at 3 in the morning. The world needs more cops like you. Stay safe out there. DC. Rick read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it back in the envelope. He slid it into his desk drawer next to his badge and service weapon. A reminder that sometimes doing the right thing looked different than you expected. Sometimes it meant arresting a hero. Sometimes it meant letting them go. 3 weeks passed. The news coverage of the terrorism arrests faded into the background as news stories took over the headlines. The suspects were in federal custody awaiting trial. The courthouse installed new security measures. Life went on. Rick was on patrol one evening when he got a call about a disturbance at a gas station. Probably nothing serious, but he responded anyway. When he pulled into the parking lot, he saw a man standing by a sedan, pumping gas and looking completely ordinary. Just another civilian going about their business, but something about the man's posture, the way he stood, triggered a memory. Rick watched for a moment, then pulled up alongside the pump. The man looked up and their eyes met. It wasn't David. This guy was younger, different build, different face, but there was something in his eyes, a certain awareness that made Rick wonder. "Evening, officer," the man said pleasantly. "Everything okay?" "Just checking on a call." "Have a good night." "You too." Rick pulled away, watching the man in his rearview mirror. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was paranoia. Or maybe, just maybe, there were more people like David out there, living double lives, gathering intelligence, preventing threats that the public would never know about. He thought about that letter in his desk drawer, about David, wherever he was now, hopefully recovering from his ordeal, about the 17 people in custody who'd been planning to kill innocent civilians, about all the small decisions and random chances that had led to this outcome. Rick didn't know if he'd ever encounter another situation like that night on Highway 95. Probably not. Most of his career would be routine traffic stops, domestic disputes, and paperwork. But now he knew that sometimes, when you least expected it, a routine stop could be something more. And he'd be ready. He keyed his radio. "Unit 17 available for calls." The dispatcher acknowledged, and Rick drove off into the night. Somewhere out there, people were planning crimes. Other people were working to stop them. And cops like him were in the middle, trying to keep the peace, one traffic stop at a time. The road stretched out before him, illuminated by his headlights, full of possibilities he'd never see coming. And that was okay. That was the job. He thought about David one more time, hoped he was healing, hoped he'd found some peace after everything he'd been through. Then Rick focused on the road ahead and kept driving, ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, that's all any of them could do. Show up, do the work, trust their instincts, and hope it was enough to make a difference. Sometimes it was more than enough. Sometimes it saved lives.